This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Kyle Nel. Kyle has an extremely interesting background because Kyle has figured out innovation. Well, he would not say that he has figured it out entirely, but he's done a really good job so far, and his proving ground was Lowe's. Yes, Lowe's. The household appliance, construction materials giant. Kyle worked like crazy to figure out ways to innovate at a stodgy, boring company. And he did. Very, very successful at it. Recently, he left Lowe's to start his own firm, Uncommon Partners. The goal, to bring that magic, the things that he found that worked so well at Lowe's, to bring it to all of us. And to take it a step further, now with his co-authors, his book, Leading Transformation, How to Take Charge of Your Company's Future. Kyle gets into the nitty-gritty of the alternative way that you can really innovate. And guess what? It's not what we all think. It's not boardrooms of yes people. It's not PowerPoint presentations that go on forever. That's not how it's done. There is technique, there's philosophy behind the technique, and Kyle gives great perspective today. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kyle Nel. Kyle, you will laugh at my last couple months. I have been working on a project. It's had me writing a touch, and I've been in the background listening and sort of watching something. And forget the newest episodes, forget the movies, forget all that kind of fun stuff. I just don't care. Because when it comes to Star Trek, it's only Kirk, it's only Shatner, it's only the originals. That's where I start, that's where I go. I have literally watched, probably in the background, working on this project, I think there's 100 episodes over 3 seasons. I've watched them all. And you know what? They're just an amazing tonic, an amazing salve, and I'm not sure they're doing exactly for me what we're going to talk about in your world today, but I think there's some overlap in a way. I think there is something to watching those old Star Trek episodes that when I'm working on a project, they put me in a mood. There's a certain creativity. They're kind of kitschy. They're kind of like, silly, but then they're very creative. They're very inventive. They're usually great stories. We don't have those kind of simple, great stories as much today. And they resonate with me. Am I completely crazy?
No, you are 100% correct. And I would even say they're provocative as well, without being confrontational. If you think about all the stuff, the first biracial kiss on screen and all of these things addressing these big, gnarly subjects, all happening in the form of narrative. It's amazing what they were able to accomplish way back then.
Yeah, we're talking in the 60s. There were some things going on there that were just not touched on. I don't know, though, if Star Trek circa mid-1960s with Kirk and that look in his eye and ladies with very short skirts, I don't know, some of the Me Too movement might be unhappy. So, it's controversial stuff. But I have to say, the thing that's really inspiring, though, I think, is the inventiveness and the imagination. What could be? And they got so much right, didn't they?
They did. Well, if you think about all of this stuff, then I think one is what they got right, but also one could think about it as what they influenced, right? All of the inventions and all of the thoughts seeded to all of these kids glued to their screens who ended up becoming astrophysicists and mechanical engineers and entrepreneurs. Think about all the people that influenced. It's kind of the classic thing of, is it art influencing life or is it life influencing art? And it's kind of hard to break the two apart.
One of the things that's really interesting about it too, just to kind of stay here for a moment, if I think about, Kirk and his communicator, right? Now that we all have iPhones in our hands, is the communicator that Kirk has before the iPhone or after the iPhone?
Right.
Right? I mean, they really saw that. But now you have taken a very interesting path, and I'm going to kind of weave you through your world where these narratives, especially science fiction, you see these narratives as extremely useful for us as we try to navigate transformation today, in today's economy, in today's organizations, for ourselves individually. I mean, I think Star Trek changes me individually. I mean, some people are probably thinking right now, this guy Mike sounds like a whack job, but let's talk about this. Let's break this apart with science fiction, and then we're going to break it apart into just the basics of narrative and story.
It all starts with true narrative. I'm a Joseph Campbellite, I guess you could say, and really breaking down the parts that make a truly good and compelling and motivating story. It is the compression code that has existed since we all sat around a campfire and told stories. It doesn't matter what religion you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what part of the world. We all speak in story. What happens is we crave stories, universal stories, so much that we now as a people are using fiction primarily, especially science fiction, and we love it and we need it so much for these future stories that we will take fictional stories that are set in a kind of a ludicrous future world, frankly, and then we will bring them back into our real life. We use that as shorthand to explain very complex things to one another, and it helps us to envision how these things might collide all together. So the idea was, if that is something that we crave and need so much that we literally are talking about Kirk back at my insurance company, why can't and why shouldn't we be using what we learned from Joseph Campbell and others to be able to manufacture future stories using the same process in science fiction in order to create universal, what we call strategic narratives inside of our traditional organizations? That was the wild idea that I had, and I wanted to see if I could do it in a unexpected kind of a company. What more unexpected place than to do that in a place like Lowe's? So that's how this all germinated and started.
I'm going to take you into Lowe's in a second. I have a funny Lowe's story from when I was a kid building a house, but let's stay at story for a second because, it is a word and we often don't think about it. As somebody who has authored multiple books and authored screenplays, and kind of like learning on the fly, not trained in this, so I'm kind of like reverse engineering the process. I'm kind of like starting at the beginning and like learning how to do it and then going, oh my gosh, these people figured out the whole process. And now I'm having to kind of look back at it all. But let's talk about stories in terms of characters, conflict, resolution, the narrative arc. Why don't you explain this? Because we often don't think about them. The average person is not thinking about 3 acts. They're not thinking about characters, conflict, resolution, and a narrative arc. Why don't you put your best professorial hat on and explain story from that perspective?
I'll do my very best, and I'll approach it from, instead of a literary giant or somebody who really understands that, more from a behavioral scientist point of view. So the way I got into this is I love science fiction and also comic books and all of the Stan Lee universe and all that. So growing up, that was what I read and what I loved and still do. So there was that deep love there that helped me frame the future world in different ways and provided that shorthand. But the thing where it all came together for me was really studying behavioral science and wanting to understand why people made the decisions that they made and how people who are bizarre and strange, we all are, how we get together to form groups and then eventually organizations. And how do you get people to understand things in order to change and to do something different than they normally would? And that is really the hard part. And what I found in my research, and I had studied, I can go talk about it this a lot more at length, but the summation is the only real way universally that we interpret and accept new information, totally new information, different than how we usually believe things, is through stories. How many times have you sat through a meeting where someone was presenting about the future of artificial intelligence or this or that, and there'd be these very cohesive bullets about the growth of this industry or the importance of this and that.
I'm already asleep if there's just bullets.
Exactly. They won't disagree. They'll agree with you and they'll even say, great job. What an awesome presentation. But then they don't do anything different. And that's the problem, is that was sick of giving great presentations like that, where people told me I did a good job, but it didn't change their behavior. So then it went back to the lab of what actually drives behavior. And what I saw in the lab and other research that others had done was that story was the only way that people were interpreting and bringing in new information and doing something with it. So if that's the case, and we understand that anecdotally as well, and if you go back through history, you see every big movement has their accompanying story or their leading story that became the movement, depends on how you think about it. Then why aren't we doing that inside of companies? And it just was a very shocking mismatch to me to see why all of the strategic forethought and these beautiful 2x2 grids of where we're going, but no story really attached to it at all. So then it goes to, okay, well then if story is the driver, where do we find the best storytellers and the best people that really understand story? And then that leads most people to Joseph Campbell, who really laid all this out through a number of his books and then also his academic writings. And for those that don't know Joseph Campbell, if you know Star Wars, you love Joseph Campbell. George Lucas has said very openly, they became friends later in Joseph Campbell's life, but that he basically took from Joseph Campbell and then built Star Wars as a result of it. These things have power, and those are the things that are becoming our universal narrative. So just like George Lucas, I also stole from Joseph Campbell, but turned it into a business tool. And I wanted to see if that could do that, to unstick a large organization like Lowe's and others to do big things that they normally would not do through this process. And there are more stages to it as well, all tied to this behavioral way of looking at things. We were able to put a 3D printer in the International Space Station and build autonomous robots and exosuits for our employees and build the largest VR, AR showrooms and stores. All of that came about because the focus was on story, not on the thing. Only then did it open up and become this amazing thing. And so that's really what I'm passionate about. And that's what I've spent the last decade really focused on.
So as somebody who lived at 6th and Market in downtown San Diego, I assume you were one of the quintessential nerds that were probably walking by me dressed up as Spock at some point in time, right?
Yes, no question. Those are my people. Look, that's a really good example. So think about that.
It's absolutely amazing to see for the first time Comic-Con in action in downtown San Diego. To see that for the first time, to see that passion, to see that enthusiasm is out of control.
Mm-hmm. If that doesn't show the power of narrative and the power of stories, I don't know what does. That is the driving force. We will give up sleep, we'll give up food, we'll give up money, we'll give up all kinds of things to watch and to read stories, even the same story over and over and over again. We've all done it. We've all binge watched some dumb show knowing full well we were going to be exhausted the next day. But you do it because you love stories. Once again, if that's the thing, we understand that. What are we doing about it? Why don't we use that understanding and then harness it and then turn it into something that we can use to make everyone better?
One more quick comment about Comic-Con before I jump into this great example with Lowe's with you. I remember attending for the first time, and I believe, and I wasn't really a big follower of his show, but I saw that Seth MacFarlane was presenting. And so I figured, well, gosh, this will be really interesting. I'm involved in some books. I want to kind of see his process. What is his process? He obviously has a great process. And so I figured, well, I'll go get in line early, and I'll go check him out. I was like a couple hours early. There's 5,000 people in line. I did not get a chance to see Seth MacFarlane speak. I mean, it was nuts, just completely nuts. Let me take you away from that for a moment, and let's take you to Lowe's. I can remember as a kid going to Lowe's with my father. We were working on building houses and stuff like that. So I had this great experience of going to Lowe's. In fact, I remember one time loading up a pickup truck with a trailer on the back, a bunch of 2x4s on the back. And at some point in time, the 2x4s were not roped down, and they started cartwheeling off the back of the trailer into oncoming traffic. Luckily, nobody was killed. It wasn't going that fast. Anyways, that's my Lowe's story. Yours is probably better than mine.
Wow. Mine's less harrowing.
Walk me through, though, because here we got Lowe's. I mean, look, anybody, especially a couple decades ago, thinking about Lowe's, this was just a standard issue construction materials place. Go get your drywall, get your 2x4s, get your plumbing supplies. I mean, there was old line guys, kind of grizzly type guys behind the counter and stuff. It was not for the meek. It was not Home Depot by any stretch of the imagination. Lay out the scenario about Lowe's.
That was exactly why I went to go work at Lowe's. It was an unexpected place. When someone says Lowe's, wonderful company, Fortune 40, massive organization, doing really good stuff. Helping people with their homes is something that's deeply personal. But it's when you say Lowe's, the second neuron to fire is not disruptive innovation. I think we can all agree on that. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to do that, to do these kind of wild and crazy things, like what I'm about ready to lay out, was that we were able to make it work at a place like Lowe's. No one could say, well, you did that at Twitter, but I work X, and so we can't do that here. Because usually in the innovation change story that's told, it's told in big, great man stories, the Thomas Edisons, the Elon Musks, that kind of stuff. What gets left out are the people who work in traditional industries in large traditional companies, and they feel left out. I just knew that wasn't true. And if we were going to have the world that we wanted, I mean, philosophically, it's going to be unlocking at least some of the potential of these large traditional organizations. It's not just going to happen from some startup somewhere. That was my focus and my goal. This is what I did. I had left academia after working there for a while, realizing that I was not going to enact big change by working and writing papers. I found in my mind, retail was the best laboratory for any idea, because what you can do there is you can prove out these ideas and then you can see them manifest in the real world very quickly with a very short cycle to see if it's working or not working. And it's this great laboratory of human behavior too. I mean, shopping is like the ultimate, right? So after grad school, I finagled my way into working at Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. Yes, Bentonville, Arkansas. It was awesome. And then I got recruited to go work at Lowe's. And only when I was at Lowe's did I really work up the gumption and also get up to a high enough level to really lay out my full plan to the CEO and to the executive team. And my full plan involved storytelling primarily, and then working backwards to build it from there. Long story short, what I did was, instead of giving great presentations that didn't affect any change, instead of doing that, instead of using PowerPoint, what I did was I gave all of our marketing research and trend data to professional published science fiction writers. There's a whole process and structure and rigor to this. They would write stories, so real stories set in a near future, so 5 or 10 years out. And then we would set the primary location of the story, so say Cleveland. So it'd be like 10 years in the future in Cleveland, what would happen based on all these inputs? And these science fiction writers are uniquely qualified and capable to sift through this melting pot of trends and human behavior and see how it all might play out in a moment of time. So these were real stories with characters, conflict, and a narrative arc. And then part of the behavioral science too was not just turning it into a written word, but turning it into a graphic novel. Because I had done research that suggested that the graphic novel is actually the most optimal way to present new information. The video, sometimes people can turn off and kind of just daydream. Just reading text is a little too taxing sometimes and doesn't really illustrate. But the graphic novel has enough of both to keep people both interested, but also give them enough to keep them focused. So I literally turned these into comic books, and I literally passed out these stories of the future. And it wasn't grandiose or bizarre, but it was a probable, plausible future of 10 years in the future in the day in the life of somebody who would be our customer.
This is not Jessica Alba in Sin City.
No, it is not. No, it is not. I would think of it as more Back to the Future Part 2 without the hijinks, without Biff chasing them around. But it is a real story. So if you were to write the story of your day today, there would be characters, there would be conflict, there would be a narrative arc that could be told. And if you were to telegraph that story back 10 years ago, what would you learn from that and what would you do differently? And in this story that was set almost a decade, almost close to where we are now, there's a couple redesign. Part of their day is they're redesigning their kitchen, lo and behold, of course, where they are using what we would call an augmented reality heads-up display. And this is before Oculus Rift came out on Kickstarter. They were just about ready to come out on Kickstarter. So no one was really talking about this stuff in any meaningful way at the time. But we were able to talk through it rather than talking about what hadn't happened yet. We were talking about what would happen if it did and we weren't a part of it. Very different conversation, much more opportunistic and much more strategic than any that I had sat through at any executive room before. From that, we had a healthy, hearty debate. And then the consensus was, yeah, we got to be a part of this. Great. So then what we did is laid out what it would take, what would we do from a make, build, and buy partnership strategy, and how would we chunk out experiments to get us closer to making that a reality before it would naturally happen on its own. So we started down that path, and it ultimately led to this year, Lowe's was listed by Fast Company as the most innovative company in AR and VR, not amongst retailers, but in the world. And that only happened because we had both used story as a way to understand the future, but then had a rigorous way of experimenting along the way to get there. But I think it just shows, once again, the power of story.
There was no Lowe's in the 1970s or early 1980s that was going to be thinking like this at all.
No. And most companies wouldn't think like that at all anyway, especially one that's publicly traded. The incentives are not aligned towards this kind of thinking, right? And it's not taught in an MBA program. Strategic thinking is actually designed to bring you to the middle. It's not really designed to force you to think truly differently. So this is really designed to help force this new way of thinking, but at the same time to use some of these old management tools to help you to make sure it's not just some wild idea, but that you actually start to build towards progress and get there.
So here we have this scenario that you're laying out, which I really relate to because I've actually written trading books that kind of encompass this. And what you are doing is creating possible things that can be the next thing. I mean, a guy like Jeff Bezos is very good at this too. He will openly say, we have failed at 1,000 things until we get Alexa. So it's this constant experimentation. But this is very difficult in a landscape where, if you're looking at that XY axis and you're thinking about change in time, most people, most organizations, it is incrementalism. I mean, everything you're talking about right now is designed to fight this incremental thinking. Why don't you outline it? Because I think sometimes people need a kick in the rear end to realize, I mean, who are we? I mean, we first have to look in the mirror to even know, are we going through life incrementally, or are we prepared for the exponential? Because the exponential is coming whether we like it or not.
Yeah, no question. I think part of it is kind of removing some of the fatalism of the future. So there's this idea, implicit or explicit, that there is a future that we're marching towards. And I thinking that way and believing that there's only one future is wrong. The future is made rightly or wrongly by the people who are the ones building it. What this does is frees up an organization to think you're just as capable, if not more so, than most to create that future, or at least participate in building that future. And that was the conversation we had, right? So, there was no VR, AR department inside of Lowe's, right? Of course, no one had one. So then the question was, do we have the capability to build that tech or to build that talent? And what would that take? And there's some healthy skepticism about that as well. So one of the things that I did, and this is in the book as well, is the first step is building a strategic narrative, critical, most important. And then following that is doing something that I find that few companies really take seriously, and we call it breaking bottlenecks. But essentially, it's like, okay, if you want X to happen, what are all the steps that are necessary for that to take place? Who are all the people that you have to influence? What's the actual stated way of decision making? And then what's what I call kind of the black market for decision making? Who are the influencers of the influencers? And then literally laying that out like your product roadmap. And then what I would do is I would lay out all the steps and all of the people that I thought I needed influence. And then I would write down what their archetype was, going back to Carl Jung, going back to Joseph Campbell. So hero, outlaw, caregiver, all that good stuff. And what was great about that was then it allowed me to kind of more methodically think through, how would I communicate with somebody that was an archetype that I wasn't, or that my group wasn't? Because the natural, back to what you were saying about the immune system, the natural way that an innovator thinks is about, wow, opportunity, we could do this, stores in space, amazing. For somebody whose job it is to keep the ship going, which is most people, those kind of things scare them because it sounds like a distraction. It sounds like something that might hurt the company. So just finding ways that you can bridge the language through positioning really, really helps to smooth the process out so that the system doesn't look at you as an enemy like an immune system would, but looks at you as actually a helper along the way. And I found that every time I had conflict, it was because I was not aligning with who they were and what they wanted. And I was going at it my way. And every time I had success, it was because of that alignment. Building those tools and just being methodical about it is like 50% of the battle. Before you even get into the solution, just aligning on that is really important.
Let me keep you for the moment at linear and exponential? I kind of breezed through it in my opening question, but I love this expression that you have, the linear path to doom. Why don't you put that in context and kind of walk people through that change time chart and thinking exponential versus the linear path to doom?
Linear path to doom is essentially if you just keep doing what you're doing and incrementally improving, your lifespan as an organization is short. You will fail. There's just no question about it. I mean, the world is littered with anecdotal and apocryphal and actual stories of that happening, where the newbie comes along and disrupts the market and the incumbent gets wiped out. If you're only just a good company that's just delivering on what you've always done and incrementally improving, you will disappear. It's just a fact. Understanding that should create a sense of urgency, which should unstick you. But more than just saying that, you've really got to see it play out. And that's why the story is so important. Because we do live in an exponential world. We just do. We live in an exponential world. So understanding that should not create a sense of fear, but it should create a sense of opportunity. You know, as somebody who's starting a startup and somebody who's running a large publicly traded company can look at the exact same set of facts and come away with wildly different ways of approaching the market. And the only real thing that they're looking at differently is one is looking at it opportunistically as an exponential future, and the other one's looking at how can I continue my incremental steps so that I can make it out alive. Very different ways of thinking. So if you don't believe your industry is on that exponential curve, you're wrong. I mean, every industry, no matter what group you're in, it is on that curve. It's just where you fall and whether you decide to be proactive about taking advantage of it and benefiting from it, or you're deciding to fight against it.
Let me give you an example, and I'll let you give some feedback too, and maybe even another example to build on this one. I was recently in Singapore. I've been in Singapore many times over the last 10 years, especially the last 6 years. One of the things that, I mean, look, Singapore is a great place. It's ultra modern. They've just got everything figured out. It's an amazing place. I really enjoy the people. But there's always been one noticeable problem in Singapore for me, the taxi system. Abysmal. You have to be at a certain spot to pick a taxi. The lines are long. You can be standing on the corner and watch 100, I'm not joking, and Singaporeans will know this, you could watch 100 empty taxis pass you because they're going on break. This was this crazy system. Crazy, right? You know, so just you think to yourself, how can this exist in this ultra modern place? 2 weeks ago, I decided, well, you know what? I'm not going to mess around. I'm just going to go ahead and get the Grab app, an Uber version over here in Asia, put my SIM card in the phone, and like that, the taxi system is gone. And you go from having this miserable taxi experience in Singapore to now with their Grab rideshare system, it's now as modern and as friendly and as wonderful as it could possibly be. And you can literally look, and I mean, at taxis in line, empty with no customers, and they almost have sad looks on their face. It happened that quick. Boom. I mean, there it is. It's that going in a linear thinking. We've got, you know, whatever the system was for taxis in Singapore, and then somebody comes along and says, okay, let's use a better idea. Let's use a little tech. Let's whack this whole system. I'm sure you can share many others, but I mean, this is the kind of thinking what would be really interesting is if we knew, for example, if there was any kind of this similar process that was taking place in a disruptive organization like this.
No question. If you go and talk to a lot of these entrepreneurs and, you know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and others, they talk about this too. They read a lot of science fiction, and that has really informed the way that they think. So whether going back and reading how great entrepreneurs and great disruptors throughout time have really done this, they've ingested a lot of these thoughts and ways of thinking, and then it kind of manifests in different ways, even if they're not applying as intentional of a process as I'm laying out. They're borrowing others' thoughts and ways of thinking and using story and the things that happen in those stories in order to help paint that vision and then build towards it. And my guess is the founders of all these things were influenced in large degree by what they read and what they saw, then they built towards it. But that's a great example of looking at systems in a different way. You know, the incremental way would have been like, let's make an app for all the taxi drivers. Well, they tried that. You know, it's called Taxi Magic in LA and a bunch of other places. And people would far rather use Uber and Lyft in the US. And why is that? And once again, it goes to what you were what you were saying before, right? It completely changes the whole context. And that's just going to keep on happening more and more and more and more. And if your mindset is built around buying medallions in New York of taxis, and you're only doing that, you're going to really suffer financially and organizationally as a result of it by not having that exponential worldview.
So here's a big question, though, for us as individuals or organizations to apply this type of thinking that you're talking about, this perspective, this way of being. We have to know what kind we are currently. I mean, for us to make change, we have to know what we are, don't we?
Yeah, and what you want, right? Which is baked into it. I look at life as a choose your own adventure book. I don't know if you read these books when you were growing up, but they were my favorite books. And for those that haven't read that, basically what it is they were these books that were designed for like 8 to 12-year-old kids. They were short books, but essentially what it was is every book was like you were living underwater, or, the year was 2010, which was far in the future back then. The first couple of pages of the book were a setup. They gave you all of your assumptions and knowledge that you needed. And then you were presented with a series of choices. And based on what you wanted to do, you could then flip to the next page that it told you to go to, and you were presented with more information. And you kept doing that, so on and so forth. And so I think that's what life is. So really, if that's the equation, then it comes in two parts. How do you get better information so you can have better assumptions than everybody else? And then on the other side, how do you make decisions better? So the primary work of this book is how do you make decisions better, coupled with how do you understand what's going on in the world so that you can have better assumptions that go into those decisions. I don't think people really take an intentional look at their own lives, let alone their companies, in order to really take advantage of this. One thing that we do in my family, which is anybody could do because you can apply these principles in your own life, and I suggest that you should, is every year at the beginning of January, we write as a family, I have a young daughter, and we write our family Christmas card for the next year. And it's not something we ever share out, but it's a way for all of us to see, okay, what is mom doing? And what does she really want to accomplish this year? What does my daughter Alice really want to do? What does she want to accomplish this year? And what am I doing? And how does it all jive together in this way that we all can understand and get on board with? So there are so many different ways that story can manifest, but it's just taking the time to really lay it out and write it down.
As you share all these examples, I'm recalling a documentary that I saw recently about this Mexican film director, Jodorowsky, I believe is how you say it. And he made all these crazy films, but pre-Star Wars, he obtained the rights to do the film of the novel Dune, which was it's a fantastic documentary. But he goes through his process of how to try and sway Hollywood to give him the funding to make this. And he finds, all the actors that he imagines to be these characters. He actually found the team that ended up becoming the brains behind the imagery for the Aliens series. He was the guy that found these guys. It was a German and a Swiss guy. He found those graphic artists, put all this together. And one of the things that he did was really cool too. And I think there's only 2 versions of this that exists. He took his entire vision of how he saw this film unfolding and he put it into a comic book format. So he has this like 4-inch thick, full color, each pane in the film painstakingly drawn, which he never got made, which is part of the interesting story. But it was the most fascinating documentary because when you listen to this guy, Jodorowsky, maybe he was not able to sway the suits in the 1970s. He was too far ahead of his time. But when I listen to this guy now, I'd probably go do anything that this guy says. He's a little older and he's definitely wild and a crazy man, but his imagination and his creativity, you're just like, man, that's what life is. And he's just a master storyteller, even if he's a little bit bat blank crazy.
The great influencers are the best storytellers. They just are. The older that those folks get, the more refined that skill and that ability gets. And I know exactly what you mean. It's just so unbelievably compelling. The ability to wrap any kind of thought in a story is incredible.
One of the things that I took from your work, a line that I really liked, which is the tendency to see things as they currently are. Now, this could be seen from a Zen perspective as being in the moment of now. That's okay. But from your perspective, I get it. The tendency to see things as they currently are. This is terribly limiting. I go through every day of my life. If you share a vision or you share an idea of something that doesn't exist, 99% of the population out there just immediately, the way their brain works, shoot it down. I don't like that. That's something new. Stop.
And then coupled in that, thank you for bringing that up too, because this is the walls that we build around our own capability and what we can do. And that what that does, going to borrow, the narrative way of thinking, you shift from becoming the main character in your own story to being a supporting actor into other people's stories too. If you start to believe that, and it happens very quickly for a variety of different reasons. But the hardest part is to break that out, and not just break it out once, but to maintain that. Because you can, in various points in everyone's life, like anyone that's decided to get married has decided to break out of kind of the regular everyday life in order to make a big leap and to try something different, and really go for it. But it's to keep yourself out of that is really the hard part. To be intentional about it and have tools to, even for me as somebody who teaches this on a daily basis, how do I maintain that I'm really staying true to what I want to do and who we want to become is really quite hard. And so that's why, once again, having these tools and staying on track is the path to success. Because back to what you were saying about Jeff Bezos, it's not the first time that you're wildly successful. It's probably not even the 100th, but it's the process, and staying true to that process is what leads to that.
One of the themes of our conversation right now, for those that are sort of paying attention, is navigating the unknown. So what can you share with the audience, though? Because I think sometimes people hear the terms and think, God, I don't know exactly what that means. But applying neuroscience, some of the newest scientific methods, what are we seeing? What should we all be aware of? What's coming down the pike?
One of my favorite leaders of behavioral economics is Dan Ariely out of Duke. His most popular book, I think, sums this up very well. And it's called Predictably Irrational. And I highly recommend it for anybody who hasn't read it. But it essentially is that we're irrational, but we're predictably irrational. And what the new neuroscience, what we call applied neuroscience, is showing is that is exactly right. Which doesn't mean that we're reading your brain and we know every thought that you have. But what we can see is that the various things that you don't believe influence you. And those that you believe that you do also influence you too. And it all comes together in this soup that becomes your behavior and your belief. And so of understanding some of those drivers through behavioral economics and behavioral science and through applied neuroscience, we can get a much better view of what's driving that belief and that behavior. And we're doing that. And it's shining a light into that unknown that seemed to be unknowable for a very long time. And we're at the very, very beginning of being able to do that. But even at this early stage, we're able to unlock all kinds of new capability and understanding that we didn't have before. And let me give you an example. So when we started down this AR, VR path at Lowe's, we needed a way to be able to measure what is good and what is bad, and how do we make an investment. I mean, these are like basic decisions. With these wildly different form factors, and even comparing it to a traditional visualization system like those fake kitchens and baths that you'll find at a home improvement store, how do you compare those two? I mean, they're seemingly not comparable. But ultimately, when you think about it, only thing I'm really trying to get is motivation and cognition. I'm trying to get your engagement, and then will that lead towards some sort of action? And the only way to capture that is by some sort of combination of asking people and observing what's going on inside of their head. So we literally put EEG headsets on people and eye tracking goggles, and we would send them through all these different environments, and it created this large normative database that allowed us to compare something that seems not comparable, like a Microsoft HoloLens, to an in-store vignette. And as we were going through this and testing all these different form factors, we could see that the phone-based AR was going to be massive, even though the industry was really focused on fully immersive virtual reality. So from that, I was able to use those quantitative measures to be able to go back and convince the executive team, we need to sell these phones inside the store. And we ended up selling the Lenovo Fab 2 Pro, the first 3D depth sensing camera, in conjunction with Google, who we had partnered with for the development. And we sold out of those phones in 4 days with no marketing. We would have never been able to even think through that, or even think that was even possible, because it wasn't even on our radar if we weren't using these new ways of assessing what's working and not working, and to see what was driving behavior. So part of it is creating what we call these new future KPIs, so that we can understand How do we assess what's working and not working? And then how is that going to change what the organization does as a result of it? And neuroscience, in my view, is probably one of the best ways of doing that, because it just is all about motivation and cognition, which are universal for all of us.
I must share with you, in 2014, a year into this podcast, I was talking to primarily traders. That was my background in my books. And I decided, just kind of on a lark, I needed more. I wanted more. I wanted to expand the conversation. I did not want to only go down that path. The first person that I reached out to, and he accepted, that was completely off my path, was Dan Ariely. That was the first one. Yeah, the very first one to come on to kind of like shift me. And then literally after him, two more guests after him was Daniel Kahneman.
Wow.
Then I was like off to the races. I was like, okay, if I could talk to Dan, and I could talk to Daniel, I could talk to anybody.
Yeah.
I could talk to anybody. Right.
No kidding.
That was a change, because it doesn't make a difference what type of, for example, podcast we're talking about. But people will pick their discipline, they'll stick in their discipline, even though if some of these other disciplines are terribly closely related, they just kind of go down the path, I'm going to only talk to investors, I'm going to only talk to traders, or I'm going to only talk to historians or whatever. Whereas if you kind of mix it up and bring these multiple perspectives on, for me, now what I start to realize 5 or 6 years later is the common thread, regardless of the particular path that we're all chasing. It's the thinking that's important, not the exact thing that we're doing.
Oh, 100%. And that's one of the principles, and it's actually the name of my company, which is Uncommon Partners. It's worded awkwardly on purpose, right? It's anyone that when you say I'm talking to or working with, people go, huh? That's when you know you're on the right track. You're going to get new ideas. They're going to challenge your thinking. You're going to challenge theirs. And that's when all the great stuff happens. And then the other part is real partnerships, where you say those things like, I don't like this person you just hired. That doesn't happen in a vendor-vendee relationship kind of way. So if you can apply some of those things, like you said, and get that mashup to happen, amazing, amazing things happen. Amazing things
Let
happen.
me throw something out, too, in terms of skepticism. I have noticed over the years that there's this certain crowd of vociferous naysayers. You know, probably the people that make fun of all the Comic-Con kids going down there and stuff like that. The skeptics, they're just like, oh, hold on. You're telling me a story. You're just trying to fool me. You're just trying to fool me. Right. You see this all the time. Like, whereas not really, it's not about fooling. It's about giving you a way that you can eat the pill inside the applesauce. We're kind of like giving you the applesauce because you really don't want to eat the pill. But boy, there really are some skeptics when it comes to story. I mean, I don't know what the percentages are, but there's definitely some pushback from some people. And I'm sure you've seen this in organizations. You walk in and you start talking about science fiction prototyping, and I'm sure people are like, okay, get this guy out of here.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So part of it is instead of just relying just on story alone, I think that might be where I hear people say that they've struggled with that, because it's not just story. Story is one tool in the toolkit for transformation or for behavior change. So if you look at it that way, then part of it was intentional, right? So people laughed at, I mean, they openly laughed. And every time I do this all over the world now with academic institutions and all of the companies, many companies that are supposedly the most innovative on the planet. And when I do this, they will giggle and laugh. That is part of the benefit. That benefit, that healthy skepticism, or maybe not even so healthy, what it does is it allows an opening, a space for people to think past what you would normally do in a business meeting. You know, if ideas are usually conveyed by PowerPoint or usually conveyed in a memo, you should do something completely different in order to jar the way that they're interpreting new information and then get them to unstick themselves. So part of it for me was just to take advantage of that knowledge and to just like lean into it and just be like, yeah, this is ridiculous. What we're doing is really crazy. And that's the intention. You're laughing right now. I'm telling you, this is part of the process. And I can promise you in 15 minutes, we're all going to be having a very heated, serious discussion. And it happens every single time. It allows for that space to have that conversation.
I love that. I love you talking about that space, that if you can find that place, that space where the skepticism has to pause for a second because they're questioning their own sanity. They're questioning their own self.
Yes.
You've just put something on the table where they're like, damn it, that guy might have something that I don't understand.
Yes. Even if they're paying attention enough just to mock it, that's still more attention they probably would have paid if I just walked in and talked about whatever I was hoping the outcome would be. And that's more engagement than I would have gotten before. Once again, I've seen it play out so many times now. It does work.
Kyle, I appreciate you coming on today. The book, Leading Transformation, How to Take Charge of Your Company's Future. People can do the deep dive and get in a lot more detail. I kind of glossed over it today, but when we were talking about story, for example, this is not just like your opinion. I mean, there's like serious academic work behind, the pros and cons of story, what it does to us. I mean, this is, you've taken a deep dive.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking with you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.